Okay, so it's time. So Delia, could you put on your webcam again? That's great. Hey, everybody. Our next speaker giving a 30-minute talk is Delia Kidd, who's a senior research manager at Cambridge University Press. She manages research projects relating to primary education and ELT. Her experience includes several years as a primary and EFL teacher, materials developer, and editor. Her interests include young learner language and classroom pedagogy. Take it away, Delia.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. It's been great conference so far. I've really enjoyed today, particularly really interesting talks. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day as well. So I'm here today to talk about a new research project that we've been doing at Cambridge University Press about children and looking at children's writing, particularly stories. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from this research so far and what you can take away from this research, what kind of insights you can get about children. And there'll be plenty more updates in the future as well. This is an ongoing project. So to give you a little bit of background to the research, in 2018 we ran a story competition, and this was sent around the world. We invited children between the ages mainly of kind of 8 and 12 to write a story and send it into Cambridge. And they would stand a chance to win some prizes, including their own story being published in an anthology. And what we gave them was a very simple template. So it looked a bit like this. So we asked them just to write any story that they wanted to and illustrate it. And so there was no restrictions to this. It was very open. They could write about anything that they wanted to and illustrate it in any way that they wanted to, mostly with drawings, but they could also use photos or whatever. And the story ran for several months, and then we decided we were going to choose some winners. The response we got was overwhelming. So we had over 7,000 stories sent to us. And these came from around 50 different countries, and it was mainly schools participating, so it wasn't individuals mainly sending in, it was whole schools or classes within schools sending. So we had about 1,400 different schools. And so we had suddenly this amazing database of children's writing, original children's writing. And we had a very difficult task to then kind of go through the stories and choose some winners, but we did choose 12 winners, and you can see these on the Cambridge blog in the link below. I think once these slides are shared, you'll be able to find those winners. So we thought, okay, well, brilliant, we have this wonderful database of children's stories. What can we do with this? How can we use it to find out more about children and what they're writing about, and how they're writing it? So we started doing some analysis, and we wanted to look at the stories from 2 points of view, looking at the linguistic features, so looking at how the children are writing their stories, what kind of linguistic features are they using, for example, what kind of adjectives are they using more commonly, what kind of collocations are they using, how do they write to express happiness, sadness, etc. But also because most of these students are non-native English speakers, so they wrote all in English, we could potentially also use this information to find out what kind of common errors they're making as well with their writing, and what the kind of L1 influence might be in those errors. So that's one area that we could look at, but then we also thought we could look at what are the kind of learner characteristics coming through. So how can we use those stories to find out what interests learners, what are they writing about, what are the themes, what are the topics, what kind of characters are they including, all those sorts of things, and be able to see if there are trends with the kind of age of the learners, where they're from, are there trends in how they write stories or what they're writing about. So that's exactly what we've started to do now. And so we had a very big task of transcribing all of the stories, because of course all of them were handwritten, or most of them were handwritten. So we needed to type them out so that we could collect them in a database and use software to be able to search them. So that's the stage that we're at now. And we also did a series of analysis of the actual stories themselves. So we asked our freelancers, an army of freelancers, to complete some metadata analysis about each of the stories. And this was both from the point of view of the contributor, so the writer, how old is the writer, what's their first language, and also what's their country. But also about the story itself, so what characters are featured in the story, what's the plot line, how does the story end, what are the themes that are coming out in the story. We also looked at location and genre, but the data there is a little misty at the moment, so I'm just going to present these 4 areas today. Also to note that we haven't completed the analysis of all of the stories yet, so today what I'm presenting is about halfway through, so this might change, but at least we're seeing some trends coming through, and they're very interesting. So let's have a look then at age. So this is from the analysis. We can see that actually we're primarily getting stories from that kind of upper primary sphere, so between 9 and 12-year-olds, which kind of perhaps makes sense because this is the age where they're more capable of writing their own stories or writing extensively. The lower age you get, perhaps they're not able to write quite as much. However, you will perhaps note that there are some children in the category of 5 and under. Well, like, hang on a minute, can children below the age of 5 write their own stories? So we were curious about this. Here's an example of a story that came from a 3-year-old, in fact, The Toothless Shark. I'll give you a minute to read this lovely story. It's remarkably written. It's a great story, I think. And there's no denying that perhaps these ideas came from the 3-year-old, and certainly the picture was drawn by a 3-year-old. But it would be very surprising if the 3-year-old could write that. So what we're seeing here really is that clearly the teacher has written the story for the child, or the parent has written it and submitted it. So there's a lot of help that's been given to them by adults. But what's comforting here is to see that the ideas are so creative and so imaginative that we can kind of assume that it has come from the child themselves. So next then we looked at first language. So this is a representation of the stories that we've transcribed so far. And this is an indication of where most of the stories are coming from. So you'll see the top 3. We've got Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, and so on. Now we felt that actually it wasn't helpful just to look at L1, and actually we should look at what country it's coming from, because obviously there will be multiple countries that have Russian as its L1, for example, or Spanish as its L1. So then we looked at countries, and here is the top 10 countries that were represented. So in fact, Ukraine is the biggest country represented, even though Russian was the biggest L1, but obviously many Ukrainians have Russian as their L1. So this is an interesting representation of where it's coming from, and most of these countries do not have English as their L1. So it's a lot of learners who are likely to have English as a second language who are writing in. This is all the countries that have been represented, so hopefully you can see your country there somewhere. As you can see, lots from Europe and Asia, South America quite well represented as well. Sadly, Africa not as well represented, but if we ran this story competition again, which we hope to in the future, we'll try and get it out to more places. Here's a nice story of that a child sent in from Turkey, and I like this because it sounds like this child, you know, really values food, loves the concept of eating, and he's even got a doner kebab helicopter there, so he loves Turkish food. And the illustration that this child has sent in is really lovely as well, because it shows Little Caesars. If you can't read it there, Little Caesars, I believe, is a common chain of restaurants in Turkey. So it gives us a little insight into what children value from their own culture. What is it that they enjoy about their country, about their lifestyle in their country, and so on. So we can learn a lot about different cultures from these stories. Here's another story from Ukraine by a girl called Alla. Beautiful picture. And this is about her family tradition of picking mushrooms. So again, it's another really nice insight into the kind of traditions or norms that we see from different countries. And it's lovely that children enjoy writing about those as well. So next then we looked at characters. What characters are these children writing about? And we categorized it into different areas. So we've got animals, we've got people, but subdivided that further into adults and children, or just adults and just children. We've also got mythical creatures, animated objects, royalty, so kings and queens, princesses and princes, people with superpowers, popular culture characters, so like Pokemon or Minecraft characters, quite popular, and then famous people, so people, real famous people. So we can see here that animals is the most popular category. And within people as well, we're seeing mostly children or children and adults, which is interesting because it means that perhaps learners are kind of placing themselves at the center of their narratives. They're writing about what they know and what they identify with, which is children or other children. We wanted to look a little bit more at this category of mythical creatures. So what mythical creatures are they writing about? So here we've got the top 12, I think, mythical creatures being represented in the data. And the biggest category was aliens, which I found quite interesting. I don't know about you, but I kind of expected maybe fairies or monsters, definitely, but aliens is quite a kind of niche thing. So it would be interesting to look into that in more detail. So maybe what age group are writing about aliens? Is it the age group that might be kind of learning about space and those sorts of things? Or is it to do with popular culture? Are there lots of cartoons with aliens in particular countries? That sort of thing. So it'd be interesting as well to kind of dig away at this data and find out a bit more about the background, where it's coming from. Animated objects was another interesting category. We thought we wanted to know what are they bringing to life, what kind of everyday objects. And perhaps it's not surprising that that nature is a big category here. So things like flowers, trees, parts of the earth, rocks, and so on. Also food. We saw a doner kebab helicopter earlier, so that's a really popular one as well. So it's interesting to see perhaps what kind of influences they had from the things that they know, but also this could be an indication of what language they're able to kind of grab hold of in order to write their stories. Because as we said, a lot of these children have English as a second language or as a foreign language, and so they're using words that they know in English to write. So here's a lovely story about an animated object. In this case, it's a rainbow, and the rainbow defeats evil Dr. Moustache. with the help of a friend and someone he meets in a supermarket. Of course, because why not? That's the great thing about these stories, is they're just a little bit bonkers. They kind of constantly surprise, and there's so much creativity and imagination in them. Next, we looked at plot. So a lot of these stories were quite long. Some children wrote 1,000 words plus. It was incredible. So we wanted to make sure that we could access them quite easily without having to read the whole story. So we asked our freelancers to summarize the stories into a short plot, a one-liner or two-liner. And here are a few interesting ones. So pencil and paper love each other, but have an argument when pencil can write on paper. So this makes me think maybe the child has been hearing his parents' arguments or something like that. The president changes his policy when he is visited by a friendly ghost. This child maybe was reading Charles Dickens, I'm not sure. And a fairy goes to the fair with the glitter penguins and loses her wand. Oh no. So this is just a nice way to capture and kind of display some of the stories that children have been writing about. But we also use these plot lines to try and highlight some of the key terms that learners were using. So here I've put together a word cloud of some of the most frequently used terms in the plot lines, which gives us a little insight into what these stories are about. So as you can see, girl and boy are really large here. Little, perhaps we're saying the little girl or the little boy. Cat, yes, interesting. Can't find dog in there, so cats seem to be more popular than dogs. Horse is somewhere there as well. So then looking at ending then, so how do they end their stories? As you can see, primarily they're happy endings, which perhaps is not that surprising, given that pretty much I can't even think of a book or movie or show for children that doesn't end happily. Maybe some of the old fairy tales, but these days all stories that learners are exposed to tend to be happy endings. So perhaps they're just writing about what they know or what they're comfortable with. But here we can see that actually there are some sad endings, and it would be interesting to see who those children are that are writing sad endings, what kind of sad endings they are. Perhaps it's a reflection of their own, what they're reading about or their own experiences. That category none is partly children not ending their stories, or we didn't receive the end of the story because of the photocopier or however it was scanned in. But it can also include those stories that are kind of about daily life, and they're not really a story. So I think one child wrote about how much he loves his cat. It doesn't really have an ending. So then, so actually, when I put these slides together, I was able to hide the endings here. So I played a little game before, but I can't do that here. So you've got the endings, you can't guess the endings. But anyway, this slide just kind of gives us an indication about how they're sometimes really surprising, these endings. It's hard to predict their endings sometimes because they're just so out there and imaginative and hilarious sometimes. I like the last one. The girl uses her magic crystal to make it snow in Kiev. I'm not sure why she needs to do that, but there you go. I'm pretty sure it snows in Kiev. Lots of other things you can do with the magic wand, but there we go. She really loves snow. Moving on then, so themes was a really, really important area and a really big area. There were just so many themes coming through these stories. So we do have a bit of a job to try and kind of categorize these themes, so it's a bit easier to search. But here are some of the top themes that we've seen coming through. And it's really lovely to see that some of the most frequent themes are things like friendship, family, discovery, helping others, etc. But please note that actually there are some of the kind of harder topics coming through. You'll see war is quite large, death is in there, jealousy, stealing, bullying. So it's really interesting to see that actually these children are not always writing about the happy, fluffy stuff that maybe they're more exposed to, but they are tackling some of the harder issues. And perhaps that's something for us to think about in the classroom, to know that actually they maybe are quite capable of thinking and talking about these topics. So what does this mean for us? What are the implications for us about this data? Well, I think that this data can be used in three key areas, really. The first is in making better choices. So if we can understand more about what interests our learners and what motivates our learners through what they're writing stories about, then we can make better choices about the type of material that we present to them or that we inspire them to learn English through. So this data is really important for that. But it's also helpful for us to get to know our learners more, to try and understand more about what's really motivating them, what do they want to write about, what is important for them and their culture and their country and their livelihood. So this is a really key way, is doing that through story writing. And finally, it's really helpful for creating better learning experiences. So when we know more about our learners, we're able to provide inclusive and safe spaces for them, where they can feel included, they can write and feel that their voices are heard, because we're learning more about them through their stories. And I'd like to invite any other ideas. Do you, as teachers, have any ideas about how you might use this information for your practice, or perhaps even might use some of these stories in your class to inspire your learners to write? If you have any ideas, I'd love to see them in the chat box, so please add your ideas there and share with everyone. I know there have been some comments which I haven't been very good at keeping an eye on, but just scrolling through. Right, so yeah, stories with the pictures are really interesting. There's a really nice idea that if you were to use some of these stories as models for your learners, so if you're setting a task for learners to write their own stories, you might be able to take some of these stories and give them to your learners, to show them stories that other learners of a similar age would be writing. This is excellent for our students to better understand who they'll be working with. Absolutely. For other teachers, that's really, really important. It's really helpful for them to see the kind of level that learners are writing at, but also the kind of things that they want to write at, and so on. Is the raw data available? Not at the moment, because we haven't quite finished doing our analysis. We're going to do this whole analysis again, and we're also going to include it in our, we're developing a corpus of primary stories, but we hope to make it available, publicly available at some point. So I'll share with you at the end my the website that you'll be able to find this information on. Be nice to take some of the stories and get learners to write their own stories. That's a really lovely idea. Yeah, absolutely. So give them the pictures, get them to write their stories, and then see how similar or different it was to the original story. Really nice. And really helpful task for kind of getting learners to sequence ideas and think about story narrative as well. Lovely, thank you. Yes, I will give you my email address at the end. Okay. Lovely ideas. Learn how to write and wrap up a story. Absolutely. So you can look at things like how are learners introducing the story? How are they continuing the narrative? How are they concluding the story? You can use real examples of that. So it's really helpful for learners to understand how to write an effective story. So, right, any questions then? I'll move to the final slide, where you can find my email address, and I'll type at the end also a link to our website, where you can see updates, hopefully, about this news. And here's just a lovely picture of some students in Brazil who sent in their stories, and they got these lovely certificates. They wrote brilliant stories. I think they actually had their stories featured in the blog. So do go along and have a look if you can. What were the instructions for students? So students were really only given that template that I showed at the beginning, and asked to write a story and illustrate it, and that was it. It was very simple. And what happened, I think, was that many schools took this, and perhaps they did it as a lesson. We didn't give them a lesson plan for it, but they might have done it as a whole class lesson where everyone wrote their stories at the same time. So people might have interpreted it differently. Are you finding different approaches to writing a story based on the countries the stories are coming from? Definitely. I think we haven't done a huge amount of research into this at the moment, but as I'm kind of looking through and so on, I'm picking up on different features. I think there might be interesting things that we can learn about how learners from a particular country write a story in terms of the language that they're using or the style. That's one thing, but also the topics. So as I showed you earlier, so we have had lots of stories about food from Turkey, so it kind of shows that they find food really important. It's a really important part of their culture and so on. Different themes that are culturally based, absolutely. So we're able to kind of identify themes that might be more popular in different, coming from different countries than others. Could themes and characters be influenced by the requirement for accompanying pictures? That's a really good question. Absolutely. If learners think that they're going to have to draw this, then they might be influenced in what they're writing about. So perhaps it would be interesting to see if that's an inhibitor or if that's actually helping them. Good question. We could definitely, if we did the story competition again, maybe we could say don't illustrate it, maybe just write about it. But I do feel like some of the younger learners, that's a bit more motivating for them, is to be able to draw it as well, since they're so much more used to those illustrative stories. I think that's any other questions then? Can't see anything else. Please get in touch with me if you think of a question later. Please feel free to email me. And I'd be happy to answer. And if you have any ideas, further ideas of what to do with this research.
Thank you so much, Delia. I was writing notes that whole time. I mean, yeah, a lot of food for thought. Like, I really enjoyed seeing the examples of what children had written, like Mr. Always Eating from Turkey and the mushrooms from the child who lives in Ukraine. And I think it's really fascinating to look at the characters children choose to write about, and also the themes and the endings, and especially the themes that you might be surprised at. And I think, and this also came up in the chat box, that it's really important to, like, I think often we put adult ideas or expectations onto children, and actually if we put children at the center of what we're doing and the learning experience that we're trying to give them, like that, it could really surprise us. So thank you so much for this talk. Like, it was so interesting, and I think that's really reflected in the chat box. There's been a lot of chat. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody as well, but mostly to Delia, because that was really engaging.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your comments.
Okay, so now we're going to have a 5-minute break.
It's really lovely.
We hope to see you all after that break. Thank you. Bye.